So we continue our discussion of how modern historians have debunked these older misconceptions or just exaggerations about the West during the 1800s. And we discussed this idea that modern historians have reconceptualized, recast our thinking of westward movement as primarily being driven by capitalist expansion. Okay. Another way to say this is that westward movement was a commercial venture. And again, this is not to take anything away from those settlers. Of course, what they did is important and brave, but that's not the primary driver of westward expansion. In other words, it's not just to explore the unknown West. Okay, there's a reason behind this, and that's tied to economics, right? All right, so this brings us again to this idea that capitalist expansion inheres in geographic expansion. What do we mean by this? It means that in the pursuit of profit, okay, which is again the engine of capitalism, it usually leads to geographic expansion. And when you think about the notion of profit, think about this, that profit could never truly be satisfied as a concept when you think about it, right? Profit, in other words, means that you need to make more money in the future than you did in the past. You need to make more tomorrow than you did yesterday. And if your business fails to make profit, you will go under and you will succumb to competition. Now, when we think about this in geographic terms, think about this. At one point in time, a place like McDonald's or Starbucks was just a single restaurant or a single coffee shop. Yet, due to their pursuit of profit, what typically happens is, well, you open another restaurant, you open another coffee shop, maybe a few miles away, right, or in a different part of the city, and then from there you open numerous restaurants or shops, and before you know it, you're statewide, and then you go to other states, right, and this is all driven by profit. So that should be readily apparent to you, and eventually you encompass the whole nation. And if your product, your commodity, is especially appealing, then this may lead to even, international expansion, right? The whole globe. Today, when you get off any airplane traveling internationally, you go through the airport, most likely you will see a Starbucks, okay? Remember that Starbucks brand or that Starbucks product was at one point in time a single coffee shop. Okay, so this goes to show how, again, commercial expansion is inextricably tied to geographic expansion. Now, we're thinking about this in the context of westward movement. So modern historians, again, have argued that the primary motor, the primary engine of this westward movement was indeed the pursuit of profit. Another way to say that again is that it was a commercial venture. And this is encapsulated in the statement right here where it says westward movement is driven by capitalist expansion. So when we think about that notion, we have to part company with this idea that there's this line separating the so-called civilized East from the Wild West. Okay, in actual truth, it's one linear movement, one linear expansion. Right? There's no true line. It's just a movement moving inexorably west. And that's the movement of, U.S. commerce, U.S. business, U.S. capitalism. Now, just to underscore this idea further, think about that notion of cowboys versus Indians, which is a common theme in much of, let's say, Western films. Well, think about this. What were cowboys doing in the West? Were they these independent gunfighters or wandering adventurers, right? Well, most cowboys, in actual truth, the reason why they were there in the West is because they were employees, okay? What employer hired these cowboys? The cattle industry. That's why they're called cowboys, right? So they're working livestock laborers. There's that term labor, right? Their jobs included like herding the cattle, moving the cattle across the open range in the West, making sure there's no strays. So they're involved in these cattle drives across, Texas and the Midwest. So again, they're a source of labor for American business out in the West. So if you look at these depictions on the slide, right, this is the lumber or timber industry. Here's the railroad industry. Here's the mining industry in the West. Okay, so much of the migration in the West is labor migration. Now, certainly there are homesteaders and settlers. We'll talk about that soon. But what we need to do is, if you will, sort of get rid of that idea that the West was just constituted by cowboys and Indians fighting each other in the Wild West. That is largely an exaggeration, if not, again, a mythic idea, a mythic rendition of what the West is about. Moreover, these myths actually obscure the reality of imperialism and conquest of the West. Modern historians have emphasized that what's happening here as American civilization moved west is that you have the takeover of land that was occupied by Native Americans to the point where by 1890, when the frontier closed, you had the U.S. Census count roughly only 250,000 Native Americans. All right, so we were emphasizing the degree to which much of this westward movement was constituted by labor migration. But of course there are settlers, and a major impetus for this movement of settlers moving from east to west was an actual act passed by the federal government, and this is the Homestead Act of 1862. And this act was, the intention was to encourage migration in order to realize westward expansion of the country. Much of this region, as we earlier acknowledged, was not settled by Americans, right? It was occupied by Native Americans. So what you wanted to do, if you want to expand the country, is encourage settlement moving west. And certainly the enticement here was free land. Now, we have to think about this. This is an era where you have this simultaneous occurrence here that's kind of tricky to think about. You have the existence still of small family farms, whereby, you see this family, they use the land to farm a diversity of crops in order to sustain their livelihood, right? But then you have happening during the 19th century, during the 1800s, the emergence of agribusiness, which we'll discuss in a second in more detail. But agribusiness is, as you might expect, big business taking over that agriculture, right? And this is something we take for granted today because, when you see the cornfields or the wheat fields today, when you drive through the Midwest, it's agribusiness. These are farmers producing for the market, in other words, not for their own sustenance, right? Personal sustenance or their family. So this is happening at the same time in the 1800s. So there are still some here that are lured by land, right? The allure of land ownership in the West is what's going to entice many of them. Okay. Now, these people that actually move west to gain this land, they're called homesteaders. All right. And they're basically, again, what's called yeoman farmers. And they're going to move west, get a hold of that land, eventually claim it as their own. Now, what do I mean by eventually? It means that with the Homestead Act of 1863, which again provided 160 acres of free land for migrants, a condition for the granting of that land was a minimum 5 years of residence, and moreover, the development of that land, meaning that, okay, you move west, you claim this land, but you just can't move to a different land, right? Within a year or two, right? You have to be there for a minimum of 5 years, and you have to develop and produce on that land. You can't just leave it undeveloped or unfarmed. So these were the conditions for the homesteaders to gain this land. Now, certainly some would prosper, but most others, in terms of, the aspirations that they wanted to materialize as they moved west and gained this land, most others' opportunities failed to materialize. And indeed, many would face hardships and deprivations as migrants moving west. Why is this the case? Because much of the best land was given to the railroad companies, first of all. And this is because the federal government sought as this goal to build this transcontinental railroad. And then that became realized indeed by 1869, which we'll discuss shortly. Moreover, much of this land in the West would be claimed by land speculators. And who were land speculators? These were wealthy individuals who had the economic ability to purchase some of this land. And what they did is sell it for a profit. So they took the lion's share of the land after the railroad companies gained the best land. So that basically left the least desirable tracts of land to the homesteaders. And many of them would find the land unarable or barely arable. Like here is a depiction here somewhere in the Midwest, and they built their houses out of mud or sod. Okay, they became known as sod busters, by the way. And this is because you don't see a lot of trees around, so they were forced to build these houses out of mud. And this is the land that was available to them, not the best land, as you could easily see. So many of these homesteaders, and let's remember, many of them were tenants, not wealthy land investors, right? They were poor sharecroppers, and they were immigrants too. So land ownership became an elusive goal for Americans, for the average American, I say, the commoner. And while they were motivated in the hopes of owning land, what we see dominating the land in the West is truly commerce. That is agribusiness. And again, this is something we discussed earlier. What is agribusiness? Well, it's the commercialization of food. It's agriculture as big business, where a company takes over food or agriculture and basically sells it on the market for a profit. And think about this in contrast to that small family farm that the homesteader had, right? On that farm, the whole family worked, even the small kids. They had some livestock, and of course, a few acres, or 100 acres, 160 acres for homesteaders. And they worked that land. They planted a variety of crops. They're involved in diversified farming. Why? Because you gotta, feed yourself. You can't just grow one thing, right? Or just a few things. Now compare that with agribusiness. A farming corporation will typically grow one crop. And certainly that's true today, right? Asparagus, strawberries, wheat, corn, or what have you. And then you have the laborers that are employees to harvest it or even cultivate it, and then, pick the strawberries, pick the asparagus, right? So this is agribusiness. And as I emphasized earlier, you have the coexistence of the small family farm alongside agribusiness as it began to develop during the 19th century. Today, you see much less small family farms, right? Because the agricultural way of life, the agrarian way of life, has pretty much died compared to agribusiness.